The twisted metal caught the afternoon light like a broken mirror, throwing fragments of brightness across the red dirt. I pulled up the quad bike and cut the engine, letting the sudden silence of the Kimberley settle around me. The heat pressed against my shirt, and somewhere above, a wedgie circled without sound. 40 meters away, a piece of wing fabric fluttered against a ghost gum, bleached white by 90 years of sun and rain. This wasn't supposed to be here. I'd been mustering the northern paddock of Billabong Station for 3 days, chasing cleanskins through country so remote that the GPS on my phone showed nothing but empty brown space. The cattle had led me deeper into the ranges than I'd been in years, following creek lines that only ran after the big wets, threading between escarpments that rose like fortress walls from the Spinifex plains. It was country that swallowed things: cattle, vehicles, sometimes people. Country that kept its secrets locked in stone and silence. But here was something it had finally given up. I approached the wreckage slowly, the way you approach anything unexpected in the outback. My boots crunched on gravel that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The main section was wedged in a narrow gully between 2 rock walls, invisible from above, which explained why it had stayed hidden so long. Most of the aircraft had been scavenged by time and weather, but enough remained to tell its story. Fabric control surfaces hung in tatters, shredded by decades of wind. An engine mount twisted into abstract sculpture caught my eye next. Fragments of instrument panels scattered like broken teeth across the red earth. I crouched beside what looked like a compass housing, its brass surface green with age. The metal was still warm from the afternoon sun. On a flat piece of fuselage near what had been the cockpit, I could make out faded letters, D-1755. My hands trembled as I traced the numbers with my finger. My grandfather's stories came flooding back like water through a broken dam. Tommy McBride had been the head stockman on Billabong Station in 1932. He'd found 2 German aviators stumbling out of this same country after 6 weeks of being presumed dead. Hans Bertram and Adolph Klausmann, attempting to fly from Europe to Australia in a Junkers seaplane. The rescue had made headlines around the world, 2 men surviving impossible odds in some of the harshest country on earth. I'd grown up on Tommy's version of events, told around campfires during mustering trips. He'd embellished with each telling but stayed consistent in the key details. How he'd spotted smoke from their signal fire. How he'd found them sheltering under a rocky overhang, skeletal thin but alive, clutching a water bottle and the torn pages of a logbook. How they'd grabbed his hands and wept when they realized they were saved. But standing here now, looking at the actual crash site, something didn't add up. The metallic tang of old steel filled my nostrils. This gully was at least 30 kilometers from where Tommy claimed to have found them. The newspaper accounts said the aircraft had gone down near the coast, that the men had walked inland seeking water. But this wreckage sat deep in the interior ranges, a full day's walk from the nearest permanent water source. I spent an hour exploring the site, photographing everything with my phone. The camera clicked steadily as I documented twisted metal and faded fabric. In a crack between 2 rocks, I found something that made me pause. A brass button, military style, with an anchor motif, not German Air Force. Not from the 1930s either, by the look of it. I pocketed it alongside a fragment of glass that might have been from an instrument face. The glass was smooth against my fingers, worn by decades of wind and sand. The ride back to the homestead gave me time to think over the quad's steady rumble. Tommy McBride had been a careful man, not given to exaggeration despite what his campfire audiences might have preferred. If his story didn't match the physical evidence, there had to be a reason. He'd died when I was 15, taking most of his memories with him. But he'd left behind boxes of papers and photographs that my father had stored in the old office building. Papers I'd never bothered to examine closely. That evening, after I'd fed the dogs and checked the generator, I pulled the first box down from its shelf. Dust motes danced in the fluorescent light as I blew off 20 years of accumulated grime. Most of it was station business, stock tallies, supply receipts, correspondence with buyers in Darwin and Perth. The paper felt brittle between my fingers as I sorted through decades of records. But at the bottom of the 3rd box, wrapped in oiled cloth, I found something that made my hands shake. Tommy's personal journal, leather-bound and thick, covering the years 1931 to 1935. The leather was soft with age, darkened by years of handling. I opened it carefully, pages brittle as old leaves. The spine creaked as I flipped through months of terse entries about weather and cattle and machinery breakdowns. Until I found what I was looking for. Times, July 18, 1932. Found the German flyers today, not like the newspapers will tell it. Charlie Bin, brought word 3 days back that his mob was helping 2 white men out in the Stone Country, track them down to Serpent Creek. Naibiitis, tracked them down to Serpent Creek. They been looked after proper, but Charlie's family can't afford to feed them much longer. Dog noun to remain a serpent fusion. Nog noun to remain a serpent fusion. Bog noun to remain a serpent fusion. Nog noun to remain a serpent fusion. Nog noun tug noun to remain a serpent fusion. Nog noun to remain a serpent fusion. Nog noun to remain a serpent fusion. Nog noun to remain a serpent. The Germans don't know the real story. Probably better that way. My mouth went dry as I read the words again. The ink had faded to brown, but Tommy's careful handwriting was unmistakable. Mimes July 19, 1932. Brought them in. Mimes to Bertram and Klausmann, both in poor shape but alive, thanks to Charlie's mob. Mimes to Bulby authorities. I spotted their smoke from the ridge above Rocky Pool. Charlie melted back into the scrub before anyone else arrived. Just how he wanted it. Diag livin'. Unbeecher says white man's help only brings trouble for his people. Hard to argue with that. I read the entries twice before the implications fully sank in. The official rescue story, the story that had made Tommy a minor celebrity and earned him a commendation from the government, was a carefully orchestrated lie. The real heroes were an Aboriginal family who'd found the Germans first and kept them alive for weeks, but they'd chosen to remain invisible when the white authorities arrived. Charlie Bin, the name meant something to me, not from Tommy's stories, but from more recent conversations. I'd heard it mentioned by Jackie Lorriman, the old tracker who still lived down in Derby. He sometimes worked the tourist boats when they wanted authentic Aboriginal cultural presentations. Jackie's grandfather had been named Charlie. He'd lived traditional style in the ranges until the 1940s, when the government had finally forced most of the remaining bush families into settlements. I closed the journal and stared out at the night sky. Stars threw harsh shadows across the yard, thick and bright as scattered diamonds. The official version of the Bertram Klausmann rescue was part of Kimberley folklore now. It had been retold in books and documentaries, a feel-good story about white ingenuity and courage in the face of adversity. But if Tommy's journal was accurate, the real story had been buried for 90 years. Another example of Aboriginal contributions to history being erased or ignored. The next morning I called in sick to the station manager and drove the 300 kilometers to Derby. The road stretched empty ahead of me, heat shimmer dancing on the bitumen. Red dirt and spinifex rolled past my windows in endless repetition. Jackie Lorriman lived in a weatherboard house on the outskirts of town, where the suburbia of government housing gave way to vacant lots and scrub. I'd met him a few times over the years at agricultural shows and community events. A small, weathered man in his 70s with intelligent eyes and hands that spoke as much as his voice. He was fixing a fishing net in his backyard when I pulled up. His fingers moved with methodical patience, working with someone who'd learned that good work couldn't be rushed. "You're Tommy McBride's grandson," he said without looking up from the net. "Got his look about you. What brings you to town?" I showed him the journal entries and the photographs I'd taken at the crash site. The phone screen glowed in the shade as I scrolled through the images. Jackie's expression didn't change as he read, but his hands grew still. A kookaburra laughed somewhere in the distance. "My grandfather told me this story," he said finally. "Different version than what made the newspapers." "I'd like to hear it." Jackie set down his net-mending tools with deliberate care. He gestured toward 2 plastic chairs in the shade of a corrugated iron awning. "You sure about that? True story's more complicated than the one you grew up with. Makes your grandfather look like a liar." Tommy kept a record of what really happened. I think he always meant for someone to find it eventually. Maybe so. Jackie was quiet for a long moment, watching a pair of kites circling high overhead. Their calls drifted down like distant conversations. "My grandfather was Charlie Bin. He told me this story when I was young, made me promise to remember it proper, said one day the truth might matter to someone." He began to speak in the unhurried cadence of oral tradition. His voice painted pictures with words, the way his people had preserved history for thousands of years. I found myself leaning forward, drawn into a story I thought I'd known but had never really heard. The crash had happened on July 2, 1932, not near the coast as the newspapers reported, but deep in the Stone Country where Charlie's extended family group was conducting traditional business. The junkers had been flying low, following creek lines inland, when engine trouble forced Bertram to attempt an emergency landing in the narrow gully where I'd found the wreckage. Both men had survived the impact, but Klausmann had suffered a deep gash on his leg. Bertram had cracked several ribs, Jackie explained, wincing as he touched his own chest in sympathy. For the first week they'd remained near the aircraft, certain that search parties would find them quickly. They'd used pieces of wing fabric to spell out messages on flat rocks, built signal fires that sent smoke spiraling into the empty sky, even tried to fashion a radio from salvaged parts, their hands clumsy with desperation and unfamiliar components. But the crash site was invisible from above, hidden in the fold between ridges. Their smoke was indistinguishable from the haze of bushfires that burned constantly across the Kimberley during the dry season. They had water for maybe 3 days, Jackie continued, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the dust beside his chair. Little bit in the plane's emergency kit, little bit they caught during a shower on the 4th day, but then the real dry set in, and they knew they had to move. The pilots had made the logical choice, follow the gully system downhill, seeking the creek that must flow somewhere below. But in the dry season, the creeks were chains of isolated pools, separated by stretches of sand and stone. Without local knowledge, without understanding how water moved and pooled in this country, they'd walked past sources of life and into increasingly hostile terrain. Their boots had worn through in places, Jackie noted. Klausmann's infected leg had slowed their progress to a painful shuffle. Grandfather's mob was camped at Serpent Springs, maybe 10 kilometers from where the plane went down. They heard the crash, saw the smoke, but they stayed away at first. White men meant trouble in those days. Government was moving Aboriginal people off their traditional country, putting them in settlements, taking the kids away to missions. Safer to avoid contact. But on the morning of the 8th day, Charlie Binbin's youngest son had been tracking a wounded kangaroo when he'd stumbled across the 2 Germans. They were in poor condition, dehydrated, sunburned, Klausmann's leg wound infected, and weeping. The boy had run back to camp with news of the strangers, his feet pounding across the rocky ground. The discovery had sparked a debate that lasted most of the day. Some of the family group had argued for leaving the white men to their fate. Others, led by Charlie's wife Mary, had insisted that the law of the country demanded they offer help to anyone in need, regardless of skin color. The argument had raged around the campfire until Charlie himself had made the decision that would save 2 lives and change nothing about how history remembered the story. Grandfather said it was Mary who convinced him. She said the spirits of the country would judge them for letting men die when they had the power to help, so they went looking. They'd found Bertram and Klausmann late in the afternoon of July 10th. The Germans were sheltering in whatever shade they could find, barely conscious from thirst and exposure. Their lips were cracked and bleeding, their eyes sunken deep in their skulls. They'd been terrified at first. 2 Aboriginal men emerging from the scrub might have seemed like a hallucination, or worse, like a threat. But water spoke a universal language. After Charlie had given them both a drink from his Klausmann, fear had given way to desperate gratitude. The second week had been a delicate dance between survival and pride. The 2 German pilots were caught between their ingrained assumptions about civilization and the reality of their dependence on people they'd been taught to see as primitive. Jackie's weathered hands traced patterns in the dust as he spoke, mapping out the country where it had all unfolded. After Grandfather and Uncle Tommy brought them back to Serpent Springs, the white men didn't know what to make of anything. They'd been taught that Aboriginal people were Stone Age, living like cavemen. But here was my grandmother Mary with her neat camp, organized like a military operation. The shelters had been positioned to catch the breeze but avoid the worst wind. Cooking fires were built to minimize smoke. Water containers could keep liquid cool even in the 40-degree heat. Everything had a purpose, a place, a reason that spoke to thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. Bertram had recovered faster than his partner, Jackie explained. The pilot had possessed enough humility to recognize that his survival depended entirely on accepting instruction from people whose expertise he was only beginning to comprehend. His notebook, the one that survived the crash, had filled with sketches and observations, attempts to document survival techniques that couldn't really be captured in writing. But Klausmann had struggled with the reversal of what he'd considered the natural order. Here was a man accustomed to the precision instruments of aviation, the mathematical certainties of navigation and engineering, suddenly dependent on knowledge systems that seemed to operate by completely foreign logic. His hands shook when he tried to weave grass containers the way Mary showed him. His face flushed with embarrassment when his attempts at fire-making produced only smoke and frustration. Grandmother Mary tried to show him which plants held water, which roots you could eat, how to read the signs that meant rain was coming or that certain animals were nearby. But Klausmann kept asking for the rules, the systematic explanations. He wanted to understand water finding like it was a mechanical procedure he could memorize and apply. Mary's patient explanations had fallen on ears trained to hear different kinds of information. Klausmann would interrupt her plant identification lessons to ask about botanical classification systems that didn't exist in her knowledge framework. He'd grown frustrated when she couldn't provide the linear, categorical answers his European education had trained him to expect. Didn't understand that country knowledge comes from relationship, from listening, from being connected to place across generations. The pilot's growing desperation had manifested in different ways. Bertram had thrown himself into learning everything he could. He'd followed Mary and the other women as they gathered bush tucker, his pen constantly moving across notebook pages. Watched the men as they tracked game and located water sources. His questions were practical, immediate. Which plants were safe? Which animals were dangerous? How to read weather signs in cloud formations. Klausmann, meanwhile, had fixated on the search planes. Every day brought the distant drone of aircraft engines as the rescue operation expanded across the Kimberley. The sound would send him scrambling for whatever clearing he could find. His arms would wave desperately at specks in the sky that passed overhead without pause. He'd grown increasingly frustrated with the Aboriginal family's reluctance to help him signal the searchers. He couldn't understand that their own survival depended on remaining invisible to government eyes. The pilots didn't know about the exemption laws back then, Jackie said, his voice carrying decades of accumulated bitterness. Didn't understand that grandfather's people were technically supposed to be living on a reserve, that they could be arrested just for being on their traditional country without papers. Making contact with white authorities meant risking everything for the whole family group, not just the two Germans. The cultural barriers had created constant tension during those desperate days. Klausmann had been particularly disturbed by what he saw as the Aboriginal family's primitive gender roles. The way women and men had different responsibilities for gathering and processing different types of food puzzled him. The complex protocols around who could hunt certain animals or access particular water sources offended his European sensibilities. He'd interpreted these practices as oppressive, not recognizing the sophisticated resource management systems that had sustained life in this harsh country for thousands of years. But hunger and thirst had powerful teaching effects. By the end of the second week, even Klausmann had been forced to acknowledge that Mary's knowledge of edible plants was keeping him alive. Charlie's ability to find water in seemingly barren landscape was more reliable than any map or compass. The turning point had come when Mary had treated Bertram's infected cuts with a paste made from native plants. The relief it provided was something the pilot's small medical kit hadn't been able to achieve. Grandfather always said it was the country itself that broke down their resistance, Jackie continued. The Kimberley doesn't care about your education or your skin color or your ideas about who's civilized and who isn't. Out there, knowledge means survival and ignorance means death. Simple as that. During that second week, the search operation had intensified above them. Multiple aircraft per day were crisscrossing the region, following search grids that occasionally brought them directly over Serpent Springs. The pilot's desperation had grown with each missed opportunity. Klausmann would curse in German when planes passed without seeing them, his fists clenched against his thighs. But Charlie's family had remained hidden, emerging only after the search planes had passed. They'd maintained the invisibility that had become second nature after generations of avoiding unwanted government attention. The nights had been the hardest time for Bertram and Klausmann. Lying under the stars, listening to the Aboriginal family speaking in language they couldn't understand, feeling the vast emptiness of the continent stretching away in all directions. They'd been forced to confront their absolute dependence on people they'd never imagined as fully human before the crash. Their journals from this period, fragments of which had eventually made it into official records, spoke of profound disorientation. Not just geographic but philosophical. Pride had been a luxury they'd been forced to abandon piece by piece. When Mary had offered them traditional foods, witchetty grubs, native berries, roots that required careful preparation to remove natural toxins, their initial revulsion had given way to desperate hunger. The grubs were nutty, almost pleasant once they got past the appearance. The berries were sweet and provided energy their bodies craved. When the men had included them in hunting expeditions, tracking skills that had seemed like primitive instinct had revealed themselves as sophisticated sciences that made their European educations seem narrow and inadequate. The infection in Klausmann's leg had been getting worse throughout this period. Despite Mary's plant medicines and careful attention, the wound from the crash had developed proud flesh around the edges. It wept a clear fluid that attracted flies and emanated a smell that concerned even the Aboriginal healers. By the morning of July 17th, fever had set in. The pilot had been drifting in and out of delirium, sometimes speaking in rapid German that none of his caregivers could understand. His skin burned to the touch and sweat soaked through whatever coverings they provided. That crisis had marked the real turning point in the relationship between the survivors and their rescuers. Bertram had been forced to acknowledge that his partner's life depended entirely on treatments and knowledge systems he couldn't begin to comprehend. The treatments were administered by people whose expertise he'd never learned to recognize. The hierarchies of his European world had collapsed completely. They'd been replaced by the simple reality that Mary and Charlie possessed knowledge he desperately needed and could never acquire quickly enough to save his friend's life. The Aboriginal family had faced their own crisis during this period. Klausmann's condition had been deteriorating despite their best efforts. They'd known that a death in their camp would bring investigations they couldn't afford. Some of the group had argued for moving on, leaving the Germans to whatever fate awaited them. Others had insisted that having accepted responsibility for the pilots' welfare, they were obligated to see the commitment through regardless of personal cost. It had been Mary who'd proposed the solution that saved everyone. Rather than continuing to hide from the search planes, she'd argued, they should begin positioning the Germans where they could be found by the official rescue operation. Not immediately. Klausmann was still too sick to move safely. But gradually, strategically, in a way that would get the pilots back to medical attention, while protecting the Aboriginal family's anonymity. The decision had required trusting that Bertram and Klausmann would keep their secrets. That gratitude would override the racial prejudices that might otherwise have led them to betray their rescuers to government authorities. It had been an enormous leap of faith, based on nothing more than Charlie's assessment of the two men's character, and Mary's insistence that they'd demonstrated enough humanity to be worthy of that trust. Bertram's response had been immediate and unequivocal. He'd given his word that he would never reveal the Aboriginal family's location or involvement, that he would allow the official rescue story to credit white searchers and his own survival skills rather than the knowledge and generosity that had actually saved their lives. Klausmann, despite his fever, had been coherent enough to make the same commitment. He'd gripped Bertram's hand as he made the promise, his eyes bright with delirium, but his voice steady. It sealed an agreement that would shape historical records for decades to come. But first, they'd needed to get Klausmann healthy enough to travel. Mary had intensified her treatments, using plant medicines that had been refined over countless generations of dealing with infected wounds and fever. She'd spent hours each day cleaning the injury, with water heated over carefully maintained fires, applied fresh poultices that drew out infection and reduced swelling, forced liquids down the delirious pilot's throat, while Bertram held him steady, and Charlie prepared whatever materials the healing process required. The week that followed had been a masterclass in traditional medicine and patient care. Mary had treated not just the physical symptoms of Klausmann's infection, but the psychological trauma that had been weakening his resistance to healing. She'd included him in daily routines despite his illness, making him feel useful and valued rather than simply burdensome. When fever had made him restless, she'd positioned his shelter to catch cooling breezes. When appetite had failed, she'd prepared foods specifically chosen to tempt his digestion back to normal function. Gradually, Klausmann's condition had begun to improve. The infection had started responding to Mary's plant medicines. The proud flesh had begun healing cleanly, new pink skin growing from the edges inward. The fever had broken on July 22nd, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time since the crash. His recovery had coincided with a shift in his relationship with his Aboriginal caregivers. Pride had finally given way to genuine gratitude and respect. That was when the real learning began, Jackie said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Once both pilots accepted that grandfather's people weren't just keeping them alive temporarily, but actually teaching them to survive in country, everything changed. They started asking different questions, listening in a different way, started understanding that what they'd taken for primitive was actually sophisticated in ways their own education hadn't prepared them to recognize. The pilots had spent the following weeks absorbing lessons that usually took years to master. Charlie had taught them to read weather signs in cloud formations and wind patterns, to recognize the subtle indicators that revealed water sources, the particular green of certain trees, the way birds flew in the early morning, to understand animal behavior that could guide them to safety or warn them of danger. Mary had shown them plant identification skills that could mean the difference between nutrition and starvation, between medicine and poison, between life and death in the unforgiving Kimberley landscape. More importantly, they'd learnt to see the country through Aboriginal eyes. To understand landscape not as empty wilderness to be conquered, but as living system to be approached with respect and knowledge. The transformation had been profound and permanent, shaping how both men would think about survival, about indigenous knowledge, about the relationship between humans and environment for the rest of their lives. But, as their strength had returned and their skills had developed, the time had approached for the careful orchestration of their official rescue. Mary and Charlie had been planning the final act of the drama. The staged discovery that would return the pilots to civilization while preserving their family's safety and anonymity. It would require precise timing, careful positioning, and absolute trust between people whose worlds had been brought together by circumstance. Trust maintained by mutual respect that transcended every barrier their respective societies had erected. Jackie's weathered hands traced patterns in the dust as he described the final week of August, 1932. Mary and Charlie had begun their careful orchestration of the pilots' return to civilization. The Aboriginal family had been monitoring search activities for weeks, watching planes pass overhead, observing ground parties that came tantalizingly close before veering away into different valleys. They understood the search patterns better than the searchers themselves, knew where the official rescue teams were most likely to concentrate their efforts, had been waiting for the right moment to guide events toward their chosen conclusion. Grandfather said the hardest part wasn't getting the pilots to where they'd be found, Jackie explained, his voice carrying the weight of old secrets. The hardest part was making sure it looked like they'd survived on their own. The official story had to be believable, had to match what white authorities expected to hear about white men's capabilities. Any hint that Aboriginal people had been involved would have brought the wrong kind of attention to the family, maybe even accusations that they'd been hiding the pilots deliberately. The staging had required meticulous planning. Charlie had identified a location 3 days' walk from the crash site where search planes had been circling repeatedly. A rocky outcrop near a seasonal water source that would seem like a plausible survival camp. Mary had prepared a cache of foods that could pass for what desperate men might have managed to gather on their own. Fruits and tubers that were obvious enough for novices to have identified, prepared in ways that suggested trial and error rather than sophisticated knowledge. The pilots themselves had become reluctant participants in their own deception. Both Bertram and Klausmann had wanted to acknowledge their Aboriginal rescuers publicly, to ensure Charlie and Mary received proper recognition for their life-saving intervention. But Charlie had been adamant that this would endanger his family. It would potentially bring government attention that could force them off their traditional country, separate children from parents, destroy the very way of life that had enabled them to save the German aviators. The pilots didn't understand at first, Jackie said, his tone carrying old frustration. They were thinking like white men, thinking recognition was always good, that being in newspapers and official reports was an honor. They couldn't see how that kind of attention could be dangerous for Aboriginal people. Grandfather had to explain about the missions, about children being taken away, about all the ways government help could destroy what it claimed to protect. The education had been painful for both pilots. Klausmann especially had struggled to understand how his gratitude could become a source of danger for the people who had saved his life. The contradiction had forced him to confront assumptions he'd never questioned, to recognize that the social structures he'd taken for granted operated very differently for Aboriginal people than for white settlers or visiting Europeans. Mary had been the one to propose the final solution, a compromise that would satisfy official requirements while protecting her family's interests. The pilots would be positioned where they were certain to be found, but they would tell a story of individual survival, of bushcraft learned through desperate necessity, of endurance and determination that reflected well on their own capabilities, while revealing nothing about Aboriginal assistance. On August 28, Charlie had led them to the designated location. He'd helped them construct a shelter that looked like the work of amateur, but determined survivors. The framework was deliberately imperfect, showing the kind of mistakes Europeans might make. He'd shown them how to arrange their few remaining possessions to suggest a long but self-sufficient occupation of the site. Most importantly, he'd coached them in their story, ensuring their account would be consistent, believable, and safely incomplete. The actual rescue had unfolded exactly as Charlie had predicted. A search plane had spotted their signal fire on August 30th, circling low enough to confirm the sighting before returning with a ground party. The official rescuers had found 2 weakened but coherent men who spoke gratefully of learning to survive through trial and error, of discovering water sources through careful observation, of subsisting on native foods they'd identified through cautious experimentation. The newspapers called it a miracle of survival, Jackie said, his voice carrying bitter irony. They wrote about the pilots' remarkable adaptation to harsh conditions, their intelligent use of available resources, their triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Everything that made the story heroic was actually grandfather's knowledge, Mary's medicine, the family's generosity. But none of that could be acknowledged without putting everyone at risk. Both Bertram and Klausmann had honored their promise to Charlie and Mary. They'd never publicly revealed the Aboriginal family's crucial role in their survival. They'd answered questions carefully, deflecting inquiries about specific techniques or discoveries, redirected them back to vague accounts of necessity and luck. When pressed for details about their remarkable adaptation to Kimberley conditions, they'd spoken of desperation sharpening observation, of hunger making them willing to try anything that seemed remotely edible. The official records had duly noted their extraordinary survival skills, their quick learning under pressure, their successful adaptation to one of Australia's most challenging environments. Medical examinations had confirmed their generally good health despite 6 weeks in the wilderness. Though doctors had attributed this to the pilots' youth and physical conditioning, rather than to expert care from Aboriginal healers. Jackie paused in his narrative, reaching into an old canvas bag beside his chair. What he withdrew made my pulse quicken with recognition. A small leather journal, its cover cracked and stained but unmistakably bearing my grandfather's initials embossed in faded gold lettering. "Found this in your grandfather's kit when he passed," Jackie said quietly. "Kept meaning to get it back to your family, but then figured maybe it needed to stay with someone who understood what it really contained. Your grandfather was one of the few white men who knew the whole truth about the rescue, who understood why it had to stay hidden." My hands trembled slightly as I accepted the journal. The leather was warm from Jackie's touch, soft with decades of handling. I immediately recognized my grandfather's careful handwriting, on pages yellowed with age. The entries began shortly after the official rescue, when he'd been part of the team that had gone to collect the German pilots from their survival camp. But as I read, it became clear he'd known something was incomplete about their story almost immediately. The first suspicious entry was dated September 2, 1932. "Something not right about the pilots' camp," I read aloud. "Too organized, too well supplied for men who claim to have been learning as they went. Food preparation shows knowledge these fellows couldn't have acquired in 6 weeks of trial and error. Someone's been helping them, someone who knows this country better than any white man." Subsequent entries detailed his growing certainty that Aboriginal people had been involved in the rescue, followed by his patient efforts to identify who had helped and why they weren't being credited. By September 15th, he'd tracked down Charlie's family and begun building the trust necessary to learn the real story. Each entry revealed more of his growing understanding and his mounting frustration with the official version of events. "Charlie took a risk telling your grandfather the truth," Jackie explained as I continued reading. "But he could see that the old man was different from other whites, that he genuinely wanted to understand rather than just satisfy curiosity. And Mary convinced him that having one white person who knew the real story might be protection rather than danger." My grandfather's journal entries from late September revealed the full scope of the Aboriginal family's intervention, recorded in careful detail that confirmed everything Jackie had told me. But more than that, they captured his growing outrage at the injustice of the situation. His frustration with a system that made heroism invisible when it came from Aboriginal people. October 8, 1932, I read aloud from a particularly revealing entry. "Spent the day with Charlie learning bush telegraph networks. The sophistication of communication between family groups across hundreds of miles puts our radio systems to shame. This man and his family orchestrated a rescue operation that would challenge trained search teams, then stepped back into invisibility because recognition would have endangered everything they'd worked to preserve. The words continued in my grandfather's steady script. History will record this as a triumph of individual determination, but the real triumph belongs to people whose names will never appear in any official account. The journal continued through several months of regular contact between my grandfather and Charlie's family, documenting not just the pilot's rescue, but a broader pattern of Aboriginal assistance to lost or stranded Europeans that never received acknowledgement. Reading these entries, I began to understand how many miraculous survival stories might have hidden similar truths. How often official histories might have erased the very people who made remarkable rescues possible. But perhaps most moving were my grandfather's attempts to find some way to ensure the real story would eventually be told. He'd interviewed both pilots separately after their return to Derby, confirming their desire to acknowledge their Aboriginal rescuers, despite the constraints that made such acknowledgement impossible. He'd documented the locations where the rescue had taken place, the specific techniques Mary had used to treat Klausmann's infected wounds, the plant medicines that had literally saved the pilot's life. Your grandfather wanted to make sure someone would eventually know the truth, Jackie said as I finished reading the final entries. He understood that the political situation might change, that someday it might be safe to tell the real story. But he also knew that by the time that happened, the people who lived it might be gone, unless someone preserved their account. Closing the journal, I felt the weight of responsibility my grandfather had carried for decades. The artifacts I'd found at the crash site, the compass, the water containers, the tools, suddenly took on new significance. They weren't just relics of a famous survival story. They were evidence of a complex rescue operation that had been deliberately hidden from historical record. The ethical implications were staggering. The compass and other items belonged not in some museum display about European aviation heroics, but with the community whose knowledge and generosity had made the pilot's survival possible. More than that, they represented an opportunity to begin correcting a historical injustice that had persisted for more than 90 years. Jackie, I said carefully, those things I found at the crash site, they should be returned to your community, shouldn't they? They're part of your family's story as much as the pilot's. His weathered face showed no surprise at my conclusion, but I caught a flicker of approval in his eyes. Figured you might come to that understanding once you knew the whole truth. Your grandfather would have done the same thing if he'd found them. But you need to understand what you're taking on. Officially, those artifacts belong to the state as items of historical significance. Returning them to us won't be as simple as handing them over. The legal complications were indeed complex, but they seemed insignificant compared to the moral clarity of the situation. The artifacts had meaning to Jackie's community that went far beyond their value as historical curiosities. They represented ancestors who had risked safety to save strangers, who had demonstrated the highest principles of their culture while receiving no recognition for their humanity and generosity. Over the following week, I researched the legal pathways for returning the artifacts. I consulted with lawyers who specialized in Aboriginal heritage issues and cultural property rights. The phone calls stretched late into the night as I navigated bureaucratic complexities and legal precedents. The process would require extensive documentation, formal applications to multiple government departments, and potentially months of bureaucratic navigation. But the lawyers were optimistic that a case could be made for community ownership, especially given the documented connection between the artifacts and Aboriginal involvement in the rescue. Meanwhile, Jackie had been consulting with his community's elders about how to properly receive the returned items. The artifacts would need to be welcomed back through appropriate ceremonies, integrated into the community's cultural practices in ways that honored both their historical significance and their spiritual importance. The handover ceremony took place on a Saturday morning in late October, under a broad-crowned boab tree that had marked important gatherings for generations. Jackie's extended family had assembled from across the Kimberley. Elders who remembered Charlie and Mary joined younger community members who were hearing the complete rescue story for the first time. As I watched the ceremonial welcome for the returned artifacts, I began to understand how profoundly the historical erasure had affected not just the broader public understanding of the rescue, but the community's own relationship with their ancestors' heroic actions. Several of the younger people expressed amazement at learning about their family's role in saving the German pilots. Having grown up with only fragments of the story passed down through oral tradition, the old people always said there was more to the story than what got written in the newspapers, explained Jackie's niece, a woman in her 50s who worked as a cultural liaison officer. But without the artifacts, without written confirmation from people like your grandfather, it was hard to know how much was family legend and how much was historical fact. The ceremony itself was unlike anything I'd experienced. It incorporated traditional protocols for welcoming returned cultural property, with contemporary acknowledgments of the injustices that had made such returns necessary. As each artifact was formally received by the community, elders spoke about its connection to specific ancestors and specific acts of generosity that had saved the pilots' lives. The compass, I learned, had been a particular source of fascination for Charlie. He'd understood its mechanical principles immediately and had incorporated compass readings into his navigation lessons for Bertram and Klausmann. One of the water containers bore scratches that Mary had made to mark proper portions for her plant medicines, measurements that had been crucial to treating Klausmann's life-threatening infections. Most moving was the community's own oral history of the rescue, preserved in songs and stories that had been passed down through 3 generations of Jackie's family. The Aboriginal account included details that appeared in neither the official rescue records nor my grandfather's journal. Moments of humor and frustration, cultural misunderstandings that had eventually led to deep mutual respect, small acts of kindness that had sustained hope during the most difficult periods. Listening to these stories, I realized how impoverished the official history had been, how much human richness had been lost when the Aboriginal family's role was erased from the record. The pilot's survival had been remarkable, not just as an individual triumph over harsh conditions, but as an early example of cross-cultural cooperation. Cooperation that had transcended every barrier their respective societies had erected. As the ceremony concluded, and the artifacts were formally integrated into the community's cultural center, Jackie pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you've done today," he said simply. "But he'd also want you to understand that this is just the beginning. There are other stories out there, other rescues and other erasures that still need to be corrected." He was right, of course. The Bertram Klausmann rescue was just one example of how Aboriginal knowledge and generosity had been systematically written out of historical records. Across the Kimberley and throughout Australia, similar acts of heroism had been attributed to European resourcefulness, while the real heroes remained invisible in official accounts. The drive back to the station took me through country that looked different now, transformed by everything I'd learned. The same red rocks and spinifex grass, the same endless blue sky, but I was seeing it through new eyes. Eyes that recognized how many stories lay buried beneath the official histories we'd all accepted without question. Jackie's words echoed in my mind. This was just the beginning. Back home, I found myself unable to settle into the familiar routines of station work. The cattle still needed mustering, the fences still required mending. But every task felt somehow insufficient, as if I were marking time while more important work waited. I'd started something with the artifact return that demanded completion. I knew I couldn't simply return to my old life and pretend the last few months hadn't happened. The breakthrough came when I contacted the State Library's Archives Division about donating my grandfather's journal. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the head archivist, was immediately interested, not just in the journal itself, but in the broader implications of what it revealed. "Stories like this reshape our understanding of Australian history," she explained during our phone conversation. Her voice carried the excitement of someone who recognized the significance of what we'd uncovered. But more importantly, they point us towards systematic gaps in the historical record that we need to address. Within weeks, Dr. Mitchell had connected me with researchers from 3 universities who were documenting similar cases across Northern Australia. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Aboriginal people had repeatedly provided crucial assistance to stranded or lost Europeans, only to have their contributions minimized or erased entirely from official accounts. The researchers were building a database of these incidents, using oral histories, private papers, and archaeological evidence to reconstruct what had really happened. My grandfather's journal became a cornerstone piece of evidence, not just for the Bertram Klausmann case, but as an example of how even sympathetic European witnesses had participated in the historical erasure. His detailed documentation proved that the cover-up hadn't been accidental oversight, but deliberate policy, designed to maintain the fiction that Europeans could survive in Australia's harsh interior through their own resourcefulness alone. The academic interest led to media attention, which in turn brought forward other families with similar stories. I received dozens of letters and phone calls from descendants of outback pioneers. Many had family documents or oral traditions that contradicted official rescue accounts. Some had been carrying the weight of these secrets for generations. Unsure how to reconcile their family's private knowledge with the public mythology surrounding famous survival stories. One particularly powerful testimony came from the granddaughter of a station manager near Tennant Creek. Her family papers revealed that 3 Aboriginal trackers had located and sustained 2 lost surveyors in 1938 before white searchers arrived on the scene. Like the Bertram Klausmann case, the official rescue account credited European organization and determination, while making only passing reference to native guides, who had supposedly played minor supporting roles. As these stories accumulated, I realized we were documenting not just individual injustices, but a systematic pattern of historical theft. Theft that had robbed Aboriginal communities of recognition for countless acts of heroism and humanity. The implications went far beyond correcting old records. They challenged fundamental assumptions about how European settlement had proceeded and who deserved credit for making it possible. Working with the research team, I helped establish protocols for approaching Aboriginal communities whose ancestors' stories had been appropriated. The process required enormous sensitivity, since many communities had valid reasons to distrust academic researchers and government institutions. But slowly, carefully, with proper consultation and community control over their own narratives, we began documenting a hidden history of Aboriginal assistance that had been deliberately obscured for over a century. The National Museum eventually approached us about developing an exhibition that would present these corrected histories to the public. The project would include my grandfather's journal, the Bertram Klausmann artifacts that Jackie's community had agreed to loan, and similar materials from other cases. Most importantly, it would be curated in partnership with Aboriginal communities, ensuring that their voices remained central to how their ancestors' stories were told. Preparing for the exhibition required multiple trips back to Jackie's community, working with their cultural advisors to ensure the display respected traditional protocols while making the historical injustice clear to museum visitors. These conversations often stretched late into the night around campfires, as elders shared not just the facts of what had happened, but their understanding of what it meant. How the erasure of their ancestors' generosity reflected broader patterns of dispossession and cultural denial that continued to this day. During one of these sessions, Charlie's grandson Thomas made an observation that crystallized everything for me. "The thing is," he said, his voice thoughtful in the firelight, "our people never stopped helping. Even after being written out of the rescue stories, even after being pushed off the land, they kept helping lost white fellas, kept sharing their knowledge, kept trying to build bridges. But history only remembers the times Europeans helped Europeans. It's like we were invisible, even when we were doing the saving." The exhibition opened 18 months later, to significant public attention. The corrected account of the Bertram Klausmann rescue anchored a broader narrative about Aboriginal contributions to European survival that had been systematically suppressed. Visitors could read my grandfather's journal entries, alongside contemporary Aboriginal accounts, seeing how the same events looked from different perspectives, and understanding how the official version had been constructed to exclude Aboriginal agency. But perhaps the most powerful element was a video installation featuring elders from various communities sharing their families' oral histories of rescue and assistance. Jackie appeared in one segment, telling his grandfather Charlie's story in his own words, speaking directly to camera with quiet dignity about how his family had saved 2 German pilots and then watched white Australia claim credit for their generosity. The exhibition's impact surprised everyone involved. School groups came to learn about hidden histories. Journalists wrote follow-up investigations uncovering similar cases. Government officials began acknowledging the need for more systematic recognition of Aboriginal contributions to Australian history. The Western Australian Parliament passed a resolution specifically acknowledging the Aboriginal family's role in the Bertram Klausmann rescue, formally correcting the historical record for the first time in nearly 90 years. Most meaningfully for me, the project had reconnected scattered communities across the Kimberley who shared similar suppressed histories. Families who had carried these stories in isolation discovered they were part of a much larger pattern. They began collaborating to ensure their ancestors' truth-telling was coordinated and sustained. On the exhibition's 2nd anniversary, I returned to the site where I'd first found the compass that started this journey. The crash location was now marked with a small memorial acknowledging both the pilots' remarkable survival and the Aboriginal family whose assistance had made it possible. Jackie had been consulted on the memorial's wording, ensuring it reflected the community's understanding of what had happened and why it mattered. Standing there in the red dirt where 2 German aviators had once waited for rescue while an Aboriginal family kept them alive, I thought about all the other stories still waiting to be told. Jackie had been right. This was just the beginning. Across the continent, in archives and family collections and the memories of elders, lay countless other examples of Aboriginal heroism and generosity that had been written out of official histories. The outback had always held secrets beneath its seeming emptiness, but I understood now that many of those secrets were about people rather than places, about acts of cross-cultural cooperation that had been deemed inconvenient to official narratives of European self-reliance. My grandfather's generation had participated in this historical theft, sometimes reluctantly but nonetheless completely. My generation had inherited the responsibility to correct what they had allowed to be distorted. The compass that had started my investigation now sat in a climate-controlled display case, properly attributed to both the German pilots who had carried it and the Aboriginal family who had preserved it. But its real significance lay in what it had revealed about how history gets made and unmade, how official accounts can erase entire communities from stories in which they played central roles, and how much work remains to be done in setting the record straight. As I drove home through country that would always remind me of Charlie and Mary and their family's generosity, I carried with me the knowledge that we had managed to return one stolen story to its rightful owners. In a landscape full of unmarked graves and forgotten kindnesses, it was a small victory, but it was a beginning, and in the outback, sometimes beginning is enough. The heat shimmer danced on the road ahead as I considered Jackie's final words to me at the memorial dedication. "Your grandfather kept good records," he'd said, handing me a manila folder I hadn't seen before. But he wasn't the only one taking notes back then. Inside were photocopies of letters, official reports and newspaper clippings that painted an even broader picture of systematic historical erasure across the Kimberley. Each document represented another family, another rescue, another story that deserved to be told properly. If you've ever driven the long road through the Kimberley at night, you know the silence, the way the red dirt holds onto stories that were never meant to stay buried forever. Hit like and subscribe. There are more stories coming.